Brian felt after 3 months, I would have given them personally 3 months to settle down and play as they're capable of playing.
Don, even with Billy's eight-match suspension?
Yes, I'd have had Terry Yorth, I'd have had Mick Bates, I'd have had Joe Jordan, I'd have had Frankie Gray. He had 4 very world-class...
There was no one like him. That phrase sounds like something you put on a gravestone or a stadium banner, but when the men who actually played for Don Revie say it, they do not say it quietly. They say it like they are still trying to explain something they never fully understood, something that changed them forever. I am Brandon, and this is Beyond Football, where the game goes deeper than the pitch. I personally think Don Revie is the most underrated builder in English football history. Not forgotten, genuinely underrated. And if you have been watching this channel for a while, you know I do not say things like that lightly. So, if this video hits you the way it hit me when I was researching it, go ahead and type it up. That hype button is right there. Use it. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. Now, before we get into the legends and their memories, we need to paint the picture. Because in early 1961, Leeds United were not a football club anyone envied. They were stuck in the second division, a side described by those close to it as fifth rate. No major trophies, no real identity, no particular reason for anyone in Leeds to care. And the city itself was a rugby league town through and through. Football at Elland Road was almost an afterthought. When Don Revie walked in as player-manager in March of that year, he did not walk into a sleeping giant. He walked into a mess. He later described the setup as undisciplined and the core of the playing staff as rotten. That is his word, rotten. So what made this man special enough that decades later, the players he managed still speak about him like he was the most important person in their lives? That is what we are going to find out today, and we are going to start with the last player first. Number 5. Alan Clark. By 1969, Leeds were already feared. They had started winning things. They had already made their mark. But Revie wanted a cutting edge that was almost ruthless in its precision. He identified Alan Clark at Leicester City as exactly that. And in June 1969, he paid a British record fee of £165,000 to bring Clark to Elland Road. That was an enormous statement. That was Revie saying publicly that this club is competing at the very highest level. Clark immediately justified every single penny. He scored 26 goals in his first season and earned a nickname that tells you everything. They called him Sniffer because he had a nose for goal that was almost animal. Revie had already had his eye on Clark from watching him play against Leeds, and what he saw was a player whose instincts suited the system perfectly. He paired Clark with the tireless Mick Jones, and together they became one of the most feared strike partnerships in European football. Clark stayed at Leeds until 1978. That is what happens when you join the right club under the right manager at the right time. You do not want to leave. For Clark, meeting Revie meant entering a culture where every detail was handled, every role was purposeful, and excellence was simply expected. Number 4. Johnny Giles. Now, Johnny Giles arriving at Leeds in 1963 was one of those transfers that looked, from the outside, like a strange decision. He had been at Manchester United, he had fallen out of favour with Matt Busby, and now he was dropping down to join a club still clawing its way out of the second division. Leeds had no meaningful history at that point. Giles knew it, Revie knew it, and rather than pretend otherwise, Revie used it. He told Giles that they would build the history together. He promised him a central role, moving him away from the wing and into the heart of midfield, where his intelligence and reading of the game could control matches rather than just influence them. Giles later said what Revie did at Leeds was simply unbelievable. That he did not revitalise a team with history, he created it from nothing at all, in a rugby-heavy city where football was fighting for attention. That is a remarkable thing to build. Giles famously told his wife before making the move that he was going to haunt Matt Busby, and he did. He went on to form one of the greatest midfield partnerships English football has ever seen. The young Leeds players hung on every word Revie said. Giles watched it happen and understood why. The man had a vision so clear and compelling that buying into it felt less like a career choice and more like joining a movement. Number 3. Billy Bremner. I have to be honest with you here. Of all the stories in this video, the Billy Bremner Bremner story is the one that got me most when I was researching it, because it so easily could have gone the other way. Bremner joined the club as a teenager, part of that early wave of youth that Revie was assembling. But it was not smooth. He was homesick. He missed Scotland desperately. His form was not consistent, and at one point, Hibernian came in with an offer of £25,000. The Leeds board looked at that offer and leaned towards accepting it. They were not exactly flush with money. Selling Bremner made financial sense. Revie disagreed. Not quietly, but forcefully. He did something that I personally find brilliantly cheeky. He convinced his own board to put a price on Bremner that he knew with complete certainty Hibernian would not pay. He essentially sabotaged the deal from the inside to keep his player. That is not just loyalty. That is a manager who sees something in a young man that the accountants cannot measure. Revie even roomed with Bremner before his debut, sitting with him, talking with him, making sure he was ready. That is a level of personal investment that most managers simply do not offer. Bremner later described Revie as totally honest and fair, a man who never badmouthed anyone, a genuinely good person who happened to be a superb manager. He became captain. He became the heartbeat of everything Leeds did. They described him as 10 stone of barbed wire, and that phrase captures him perfectly. When Brian Clough arrived in 1974 to replace Revie, one of the first things he did was attack the players and their medals. He told them those medals meant nothing. And Bremner and the others pushed back hard, not because they were difficult, but because Clough was attacking the family that Revie had built. That family could not be transferred. It could not be replicated. It belonged to one man. Number 2, Eddie Gray. Right, I need you to picture this properly. It is 1963. A 15-year-old boy steps off a train at Leeds Station. He has come all the way from Glasgow. He has been chased by Celtic, by Chelsea, by Manchester United. Big clubs, clubs with history and resources and famous names. And yet, here he is, at Leeds Station. Why? Because Don Revie had personally travelled to Scotland weeks earlier to sit with the Gray family and convince them that Elland Road was the right place for their son. And when young Eddie Gray stepped onto that platform, there was the manager of Leeds United, waiting, exactly as promised. That moment alone tells you almost everything you need to know. Revie then went further. He personally visited Gray's school headmaster to negotiate an early release so Gray could sign for Leeds before his 16th birthday. Eddie waited outside the office. Minutes later, the headmaster came out, shook his hand, and wished him luck. Revie had sorted it. He kept sorting it. Home visits to check on Gray's parents, flowers sent when a family member was ill, constant attention and care that made a teenager from Castlemilk feel like he was not alone in a new city. When Gray trained with the first team in his early days, Revie was watching everything. There is a story of a session in the snow where young Eddie nutmegged the great Jack Charlton. Charlton did not take that well, as you might imagine. His response was physical and immediate. But Revie kept his eyes on Gray, not to stop it, but to see what the boy was made of, whether he would get back up. He did. Revie said of Gray that when he played on snow, he did not leave any footprints. That is a line that sounds like poetry, but Revie meant it as the highest possible technical compliment. Gray later said Revie was the father figure who brought them all together like a family, a man who would do anything for you and for your people, and he meant every word. Now let us talk about what sat underneath all of this warmth, because there was a machine running beneath the surface, a system that was, in many ways, decades ahead of its time. It started with the dossiers. Back in the 1963 to 1964 season, Revie asked his first team coach, Sid Owen, to produce a detailed analysis of a young player the club was considering. Owen came back with something so comprehensive, so forensic, that Revie called it a masterpiece. And from that moment, the dossier became the standard blueprint for how Leeds prepared for every opponent. These were not brief summaries. They were detailed psychological and physical profiles. Height, build, favoured foot, control, bravery, tackling ability, turning speed. Specific notes about mental character. Revie's own son, Duncan, recalled examples where his father would tell Jack Charlton precisely which side a particular striker preferred to head the ball from. That is the level of granularity we are talking about. Norman Hunter described the dossiers as very thorough, saying Revie never got his information wrong and would not allow mistakes. In team talks, Revie would quiz his players on what they had read. If a player could not answer, the disappointment on Don Revie's face was enough. No shouting needed. Silence was punishment. A management consultant cited Revie in 1967 as a premier example of how professional management could transform an entire industry. Revie introduced what he called pilot plant conditions for testing young players, using medical equipment as measuring instruments to evaluate physical capacity and development. He insisted on high-quality hotels for away trips, so players arrived rested and prepared rather than cramped and tired. He moved the club from a six-figure overdraft to profits of £60,000 or more per year. He switched the kit from traditional yellow and blue to all white, deliberately inspired by Real Madrid. He wanted his players to feel like they belonged in the company of the best teams in Europe. Tactically, he was equally fluid. His base was a 4-3-3 formation, but he shifted freely into 4-2-4, 4-4-2, and even 4-5-1, depending on what each match demanded. He moved Terry Cooper from winger to left back. He moved Bremner and Giles from wide positions into the centre. He saw what players could be, not just what they already were. And then there was the family culture itself, which was engineered as deliberately as any tactical setup. Revie believed that domestic harmony directly affected on-pitch form. He preferred his players to be settled. He hosted pre-season parties for directors, staff, players, and their wives together, because he understood that if the people around the players were happy, the players would be more focused. On away trips, often staying at the Craiglands Hotel in Ilkley, the squad would play bingo and carpet bowls together. Eddie Gray and Peter Lorimer were known for running the friendly betting on those carpet bowl sessions. It sounds almost comically wholesome by modern standards, but it worked. It kept the group bonded and focused on each other rather than drifting off into city distractions. Before matches, the whole squad performed the Leeds United wave together to all four sides of the ground, a collective ritual that said, "We are one thing." Revie also brought in ballet training for poise and balance, introduced specific dietary controls, and paid close attention to physical conditioning in ways that were unusual for English football at the time. He treated his players like sons. But on the pitch, he wanted them to be animals. That combination of warmth and ruthlessness was the engine of everything. And yet, for all his scientific precision, Don Revie was also one of the most superstitious men in the history of the sport. He became convinced that Elland Road itself was cursed. Not struggling, not unlucky, actually cursed by travellers who had been displaced during the stadium's construction. So, in the early 1970s, he hired a woman named Laura Lee, described as a gypsy witch from Scarborough, to come and lift the spell. Laura Lee scattered seeds on all four corners of the pitch and on the centre circle. There were other acts Revie refused to discuss publicly. Many believed the ritual included urinating on the corner flags to bless the territory, though Revie would never confirm that detail. He had personal phobias too. He feared peacocks and owls, viewing them as bad omens, which is why he had the owl removed from the club badge and dropped the traditional peacock nickname entirely. He also had a profound fear of ornamental elephants. His lucky blue mohair suit went with him everywhere, year after year, even as it became threadbare. Before each match, he followed a specific walking route to a set of traffic lights, touched a particular lamppost, and carried chunks of wood and a rabbit's foot in his pocket. He even wanted his wife Elsie to wear what he considered her lucky coat to matches. This was the same man producing forensic psychological dossiers on Finnish wingers. The contradiction was real, and it made him human. Number 1. The moment that showed he was human in a different way came in 1966. In the Intercities Fairs Cup semi-final, Leeds faced Real Zaragoza. Revie was concerned about the pace and skill of the Spanish attackers on a firm pitch. His solution was to have the Elland Road turf flooded by the fire brigade before the match, turn it into a quagmire, make conditions so heavy that their natural game would be neutralised. Eddie Gray later said the plan was simply wrong, and he was right. Zaragoza adapted far better than Leeds did. They scored 3 goals in the first 13 minutes. The match was effectively over. Revie was humble enough to stand up and admit it. He named their forward line the Magnificent Five, a generous and public acknowledgement of superior quality. That moment reveals something important. He was not infallible. He got it wrong, but he owned it. And that honesty was part of what made made his players trust him so completely. When Revie left in July 1974 to take the England job, he left behind a club he had built entirely by hand. 2 First Division titles in 1968 to 1969 and 1973 to 1974. The FA Cup in 1971 to 1972, the League Cup in 1967 to 1968,
The Intercities Fairs Cup twice in 1967 to 1968 and 1970 to 1971.
the Charity Shield in 1969 to 1970, and the Second Division title in 1963 to 1964, which started everything, from 5th rate to the finest team in Europe in 13 years. And when Brian Clough arrived and told those players their medals meant nothing, the whole project fell apart within 44 days. Because what Clough could not understand, and what no amount of managerial ego can replace, is the bond that a true family creates. Revie built that bond one player at a time, one train platform at a time, one bunch of flowers at a time, one dossier at a time. The legends who played for him all say the same thing in the end. Meeting Don Revie was not just the start of a football career, it was the start of a life. He was a father to them in the most genuine sense of the word, while simultaneously being the most ruthlessly well-prepared manager English football had ever seen.
The man who sent flowers when your mum was ill and handed you a 12-page analysis of the winger you would be marking on Saturday. The man who hired a gypsy to lift a curse and a consultant to modernize his methods in the same breath. There was no one like him. The legends knew it then, they know it now, and honestly, the more time I spend with this story, the more I think English football has still not fully reckoned with just how extraordinary he was. If you agree, or if you think I've missed something, leave it in the comments below. I would genuinely love to know which part of Revie's story hits you hardest. And if you have not already, make sure you subscribe and drop a like on this one. It took a lot of research, and it means a great deal when you show the video some support. See you in the next one.